Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, two of the most unpredictable leaders, sat down face-to-face in Singapore. This is the first meeting between the sitting U.S. president and the DPRK leader in history. Well, Trump said he had forged a terrific relationship with Kim at the start of the meeting. Will we eventually witness the complete, verifiable, irreversible disarmament of the DPRK? How will the historic summit reshape the fate of the region? And how do we understand China's role and stakes in the situation? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Su Ge, chairman of the China Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, and Anna Tangen, a northern columnist. We shall also speak to Mira Lu and Joseph Kim, our CGTN correspondents in Singapore and Seoul, respectively, via satellite. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. But before we get started, let's take a look at this.
A historic handshake under the world spotlight. Ice-breaking talks held between two old enemies.
I feel really great. We're going to have a great discussion, and I think tremendous success. It'll be tremendously successful. And it's my honor, and we will have a terrific relationship, I have no doubt.
Well, it was not easy to get here. The past worked as fetters on our limbs, and the old prejudices and practices worked as obstacles on our way forward, but we overcame all of them, and we are here today.
Trump and Kim's one-to-one talks lasted for 41 minutes, before the pair were joined by their advisors in an expanded bilateral meeting. Everything seemed to go well at the negotiation table, and so on to their working lunch. And a very interesting question from an opportunistic reporter.
Thank you. Will you invite Chairman Kim to the White House? Absolutely, I will.
A very positive answer following very positive talks. The leaders signed a joint agreement which requires the DPRK to work towards denuclearization. Something which Kim was very happy to give his full support to.
The world will see a major change.
Rory Cohn, CGTN.
Welcome to our discussion here, gentlemen. Are you surprised about the summit itself?
Actually, it's within our expectations. Of course, to some people, it's a little out of the expectations. Let me explain why. I think that for the two countries, United States and the DPRK, over half a century, both regarded each other as adversaries, enemies. And in the end, the leaders of both countries could sit down and talk about the future peace agreement. I think that's something that's something that should be welcomed, and that's in the right direction, in which China has always been hoped for and strive for, and China offers its welcome and support for the peace process.
And what do you think of breakthroughs, if any, in the joint statement? And do you believe this game changer will bring about lasting peace, prosperity through the peace agreement to apply finishing touches to the truce that was signed in 1953 by the end of the Korean War?
Well, quite frankly, I see it as a fairly empty photo op at this point. There has been very few details. There was nothing about a peace treaty. There's nothing that defines what denuclearization means. There's no timetable. There's no anything about what kind of support is necessary. I think to really get a sense of the disappointment in this, you have to go to President Trump's his public statement afterward. He gave a press conference the first time for an hour, and he talked about things. The most important thing I think was in there is that he has no intention of paying any of the price of trying to help the North Koreans reform their economy. He said that this would be up to South Korea and Japan.
Thank you so much. Let's go to our CGTN correspondent in Seoul for the immediate feedback from ROK, which has played a decisive role in putting together Mr. Donald Trump and Mr. Kim Jong-un. Hello, Joe.
Hello.
Do you think positive response or just calm reactions to the results of this long-awaited summit in Singapore from ROK?
Well, we heard from the South Korean president who welcomed the decision. He said that it took a lot of bravery and courage for U.S. President Donald Trump and DPRK leader Kim Jong-un to come here, and he said that they'd be taking a step forward for peace on the Korean Peninsula as well as for peace in the world. Now, that seems to be the government stance, but we are seeing other political sides really reacting to this news, especially during the presser when Donald Trump did say that he does see the military exercises between the United States and South Korea as something provocative. He called them war games, and he said that for now he is thinking about making sure that it doesn't happen for the time being, especially because it's very costly for the United States. He said that unless South Korea wants to take more of that financial burden, that for the time being they would not do these military exercises. Now, this is something that South Korea has reacted to. They said they need more understanding on the matter. So it does seem to be a situation that South Korea is still assessing.
We were able to see a flurry of proactive diplomacy on the side of DPRK in the past months across the 38th parallel and between Washington and Pyongyang. So what's going to happen next immediately? Joe?
Well, I think the South Korean government is going to continue what they had agreed upon with the DPRK in terms of their Panmunjom Declaration, implementing further cooperation between the two countries and really trying to get more exchanges happening, especially because there was promises made, and unlike this declaration that was signed by Trump and Kim, we know that in the Panmunjom Declaration there is timelines for certain things to be happening. So it does seem that the South Korean government is committed to those timelines, and they will try to execute what they had committed to. Now, the biggest problem, however, is that denuclearization. The details on how they will really verify whether it happens or not is still up in the air, especially because there was no details out of this current summit. But it does seem that South Korea is still willing to move forward with the DPRK.
Well, the U.S. government has made it very clear over and over that the economic sanctions will be maintained there, will not be minimized. However, President Trump did say that the war game will be halted as a result of this summit meeting. Now, what do you think of the chance for the United States to establish the embassy in Pyongyang so that opportunity costs will be reduced drastically, laying the groundwork for further normalization?
Well, from the positive side, I think we need to look at it from both sides. From a positive perspective, we could say, well, this is the start. It could be a start of a new process for peace.
What does the process here actually mean?
Well, actually it takes some time. And from the negative side, you could say, well, because the document, you address certain things, but without going into details. Of course, then it would leave to the critics
That's
to
the
say that,
area where Anna Tangen felt quite disappointed about lack of details in the joint statement.
But I tend to focus more on the positive side, but because I'm more cautiously optimistic. Because this time, when we see the situation before the talks, there had been a lot of talks about the CVRD or CVRG, complete, verifiable, irreversible destruction. But the North Koreans said no. Change the D into G, guarantee for our regime, for our survival, and so forth, so on and so forth. But in the end, in the document, I think two things struck me. That is C and G. That is a complete destruction of the denuclearization of the peninsula. It is mentioned in the documentation as nothing that U.S. offered security guarantee for this stuff. But anyway, for a quandary of this magnitude, you cannot expect to be solved, all the problem to be solved overnight. So we pin hopes for the future.
Thank you so much. Let me cross over to our CGTN correspondent, Mira Lu, who's standing by in Singapore, the city-state, for the latest. Hello, Mira. In a few minutes, President Trump will be leaving for the United States. And what do you think of the immediate response from the Singaporean government, the host of this the summit?
Yes, Yang, after U.S. President Donald Trump's press conference, in fact, he has left Singapore on his Air Force aeroplane already. And Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong issued a statement. He said that he congratulates both Trump and Kim on had this historic summit right here in Singapore. He said it is a crucial first move in the long journey towards lasting peace and stability on a denuclearized Korean peninsula. Yang.
Thank you so much for briefing us on the official statement from the Singaporean government. But don't you think, guys, that the mere fact the summit took place in Singapore, and that's the first of its kind between leaders of the two countries, is a huge success, not only for the two countries, but for peace and stability of the whole region? Anna.
I'm going to look at it from a PR angle, and I'm going to say that Kim won this particular bout. He has managed to have meetings with the most powerful people on earth, Xi Jinping, Donald Trump, and soon to be Putin. He has elevated himself and projected a new image, which is reflected in his popularity. But in the end, this has not been a great thing for the U.S. This is the minimum.
A couple of minutes ago, Anna, you complained that there was a lack of details. However, Mr. Kim did agree to destruction of a missile testing site, and that's viewed as a concrete step forward in the correct direction to win the confidence and to build the confidence.
Yes, but destruction of a missile testing site is not a big deal because you can test missiles almost anywhere. You can fire them out over the ocean as they happened before. It is not a concrete way, a concrete symbol, the same way it would be to let inspectors come in and verify and identify what it is. Also, what strikes me most is that Donald Trump wants to do diplomacy on the cheap. In almost every single one of his answers, he talked about the cost, and how the U.S. was not going to pay. Even went so far as to say that the war games should be paid by South Korea. This has been something that he put on the campaign trail. It's something that he feels strongly about. But in the end, he has no game plan, and there is no game plan currently. As the Singaporean said, this is the beginning of a long journey, but Donald Trump has been a man very much in a hurry.
Yes, very much so, the end of a beginning. Let me go back to Joe for his comments on details of the joint statement. Joe, devils always exist in details. We are discussing why no specifics have been mentioned in the joint statement so that all parties would feel optimistic about what's going to happen next in the immediate aftermath. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think as we've heard, just as there are missing details, the South Korean government so far has continued to say that they also believe that this is a process, especially when negotiations were first happening. We heard from the United States that said they wanted the immediate denuclearization of the DPRK, whereas South Korean President Moon Jae-in, after he met Kim Jong-un the second time, he specifically said in his presser that he believes that this is going to be a process that takes time. This is why he's called this entire diplomacy plan of his the peace process. So in terms of the South Korean government's perspective, we know that they understand that this is going to take time, and even if details perhaps are missing in this summit, that they do continue to try to work with the DPRK and the United States to make sure that denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula happens, and as they said, ensure that peace is on the peninsula.
At least that's the silver lining of the darkest clouds descending on the Korean Peninsula, a divided one since the end of the Korean War in 1953. Let me go back to Mira Lu. Hello, Mira. Now, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said up to 20 million Singaporean dollars were spent on the preparations for this summit meeting. Now, most of that went to security measures. So what do you think of the success of the summit from this perspective? Because after all, Singapore has played a very constructive role in making this a big success in terms of public relations, as Anna Tangen said a few minutes ago.
Yes, I think speaking from the Singapore being the host perspective, I think Singapore had done a great job. You mentioned that $20 million. Before leading up to the summit, Singapore netizens were complaining about why are we using taxpayers' money for this event that has nothing to do with us. But the PM Lee said this has everything to do with us. It has everything to do with regional security, with world peace. And this is the small bill that Singapore is very happy to fork out. And he mentioned that $20 million, half of them will go to security preparation. And the Singapore Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan also confirmed that Singapore treated the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un as well as his delegation. So Singapore paid hotel bills for them. And not to mention where I stand right now, the International Media Center. The official announcement is like we have about 3,000 international journalists here. 80% of them, 3,000 journalists, 80% are from overseas. And earlier today, the U.S. side said the number can reach to 5,000. So there's this whole space here, and then you haven't been to the dining hall here. Singapore is really here to impress. They brought out all the Singapore dishes, huge buffet. Singapore really took this opportunity because they know this is the moment that the world is looking at Singapore. So they not only facilitated and be the good host, they also use the opportunity to make a branding. It's a branding opportunity for Singapore. They really want to showcase that this small nation is punching beyond its weight in terms of diplomacy. Yeah, right.
Mira, you put your finger on a very interesting issue about branding of Singapore. Not only was the 1992 consensus about when China reached here, but Mr. Deng Xiaoping, our late senior leader, chose Singapore as one of the two countries to visit after he took office with the end of the Cultural Revolution. This year witnessed the 40th anniversary of China's opening up, and Deng Xiaoping learned a lot, drew a lot of inspirations from Singapore. Mr. Xi Jinping met with Ma Ying-jeou, former leader of Taiwan, also in Singapore. So the question is, why Singapore? Why not China, Mongolia, Switzerland for the site and the venue of this historic summit between Washington and Pyongyang? What do you think that finally prompted the parties concerned to choose Singapore and Sentosa Island as the eventual site?
Yes, that's a good question. There are a couple of reasons in play here. First of all, let's talk about diplomacy. So they want to choose a neutral place. Singapore has had a good relationship with the U.S. for many years. It's a strategic partner, allies. And Singapore also has a good relationship with DPRK compared to many other countries. Singapore has been doing business with DPRK before the sanctions kicked in. So diplomacy-wise, and DPRK has an embassy here in Singapore, so that made the logistics and preparation a lot easier. The second is the geographic reason. Singapore praised itself to be the connection, the center, the connect between the East and West. As you mentioned, that the Wanggu Huitan took place here, and the historic Xima meeting also took place here in 2015. So Singapore really wants to be the Geneva of the East, if you like to put it that way.
That's indeed a very interesting figurative speech about the image of Singapore. Yes, and thank you so much, Ambassador Su Ge. What do you think of the choice of the site? What does that mean for the success of the summit?
For Singapore?
Yes, of course.
I think, as the lady who has just said, Singapore seemed to be the natural choice, because out of a number of candidates, and you use the method of ruling out, and U.S. of course wanted to have something, have the meeting to be chosen in one of its allies, and Singapore happens to be the country that maintains diplomatic relations with both the United States and DPRK. So finally, that would make
Mr. Kim Jong grew up and he studied his primary education in Switzerland. Initially, Switzerland was also
considered a strong
my feeling is
candidate. That the venue is one very important factor, but the most important factor is the political will. to enter into negotiations, because no matter what you do, if you have the willingness to enter into negotiation, I think that just now we made a lot of we talked a lot about Singapore's role. I would like just to call your attention to the role played by China, because China has been the country which has been calling for the dual concession, calling for the double tracks, and we are calling for the replacement of with a peace treaty for the old disarmament treaty. And this time, China has even, at the request of DPRK, we offered the Boeing special airplane for the Korean delegation. So I think China has been a responsible member of the community. It has made important contribution for peace, stability in the region, for the purpose of denuclearization and
about all the peace agreement, if any would be reached with the participation of China, one party to the Panmunjom truce back in 1953. So what do you think of the use of the China airplane for Mr. Kim to be shaped from DPRK all the way to Singapore? Robert Kelly, a professor in Pusan National University, said, well, this ironically showcases that China should have done more. And the American authorities would have good reasons to question the role that China played previously. So what do you think of the controversies surrounding the role China played? The Chinese voice says loud and clear, we have done a lot proactively to make it a success.
Well, quite frankly, China wasn't invited to the party now. And I think if you look at it dispassionately and you put aside your prejudices, it's quite clear that China has been very willing. I mean, it was 2 meetings with Xi Jinping, with Young Kim. He was giving him the confidence to go ahead with this process. I don't think that anyone can be pointing to China. And quite frankly, even before the communique was signed, while they were still waiting, the Chinese Foreign Ministry sent a message saying that China stands by and willing to help this process. This is a showing of goodwill. They did not know what was in that communique. So I don't think it's proper to start saying things. Now, the other thing is that the U.S. has said repeatedly that they expect China to be a big hand in this negotiation. And once again, I think this is about payment. Who is going to fund the reconstruction of North Korea?
No, China was not invited to go to Singapore, but Secretary of State Pompeo will allegedly come to Beijing to brief Chinese leaders about the results of the summit in Singapore. After all, as I said earlier, China is a very important party in the Korean War. Let me go back to Joe. What's going to happen to Northeast Asia with a silver lining on the horizon? Because pretty soon we imagine that the UN economic sanctions will be lifted on conditions of the CVID process moving forward. A lot in China say, well, this might be a good opportunity for people in Dongbei, Heilongjiang, Jilin, and Liaoning to further open up, because the regional integration would largely depend on the open border between the DPRK and the 3 provinces in northeastern China.
Well, we've heard from Donald Trump during the presser, who said that he wouldn't let up on sanctions until they were able to verify that the DPRK had completely denuclearized. We also heard this from Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who has maintained that he wishes to keep maximum pressure on. And we've also heard from South Korea's government, Moon Jae-in, saying that sanctions has to keep going on until denuclearization is complete. Now, in terms of South Korea's plan for what they want in terms of the DPRK opening up, they definitely want more railroads and trade routes between the DPRK, South Korea, as well as China and Russia to open up, so that this would create more of a flow of money throughout the entire region. Now, whether or not this is possible is really going to be dependent on the process and whether the UN lifts these sanctions, but those sanctions are really dependent on the denuclearization of the DPRK, which still is, as you said, in the details for the time being, even though we do have this fine silver lining in terms of the fact that the process has started, but there's still a lot of work to be done before we understand the economic prosperities that could really result from all of
Joe,
this.
let's take a closer look at the image and profile, capability, and vision of Mr. Kim Jong-un, leader of the DPRK. Many here in China quietly compare him to perhaps the architect of China's opening up and the reform, late senior leader Deng Xiaoping. Because you look at the landmark conference of the North Korea's Workers' Conference, the Party Conference, Mr. Kim vowed to reprioritize the principles and missions of the ruling party by focusing on economic reform and reconstruction of the poor country instead of still going ahead with the military first principle that's been practiced perhaps since the end of the Korean War. Do you think that's likely to happen? And also, don't forget, we have this problem across the Taiwan Strait. We're talking about prospects of having reunification between Taiwan and the mainland. Do you think Mr. Kim Jong-un is likely to follow the role example of Jiang Jingguo, son of Chiang Kai-shek, the late dictator of Taiwan, and eventually they're going to have a dramatic liberalization of the institutions there? We have many interpretations about what's going to happen next, in the next major move.
Well, in terms of the aesthetics, his outfit, what Kim Jong-un decided to wear, we know that instead of a Western-style suit, he chose to wear his traditional socialist, showing to the world that he really is going to stay in the foundation and political structure that his government is currently in terms of other things, his hair, other aesthetical features that he decided to portray on this world stage. It seems very similar to his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, and this has been copied throughout his leadership in the DPRK position. Many people say this is because in terms of reverence, we know that Kim Il-sung is revered more than his father, Kim Jong-il, and this is something that Kim Jong-un is trying to really imitate and try to present for himself as well. In terms of the military first priority that Kim Jong-un may still have, we know that nuclear weapons has really been something that they could deter the United States with. They've felt that safety hasn't been guaranteed on their part. Therefore, they needed something that could equally, on equal footing with the United States, fight off or ward off the United States.
Thank you so much. And there's a lot to be addressed. Despite the glow of success in Singapore, very quickly, Anna and Ambassador Suga, do you think the only winner of this summit is not Donald Trump, not Kim Jong-un, but President Moon Jae-in? He's likely to be the strongest candidate for being the laureate of the Nobel Peace Prize for the year 2019. He played so much role. I mean, he contributed so much, so enormously to the preparations and the eventual success of the summit.
I think that the talks between Kim and Trump is the start of a long process, but not the end of it. During which, although it's only a minimum start, but you know.
But don't forget, President Obama won Nobel Peace Prize for talking smart on a nuclear-free world, but nothing happened ever since. So what do you think of the chance for President Moon Jae-in to win the Nobel Peace Prize?
We're going to have to wait and see what happens in this process. I agree with the ambassador that this is a process going forward, but I think the winner was him and also the people of South Korea. The mere fact that they're trading handshakes and letters is better than bombs and bullets.
Yeah. And Joe, very quickly, your answer about the chance of Nobel Peace Prize. All right, thank you so much. That's the conclusion of our very dynamic discussion about the just concluded summit meeting between Donald Trump and Mr. Kim Jong-un. I'll continue the discussion on dialogue when we meet next time. Thank you so much for being with us. Goodbye.